My selfish brother secretly tried to auction off our family farm to pay his debts. I found out purely by accident. I was cleaning out Dad's desk after the funeral when I discovered a folder marked property transfer hidden behind old tax documents. Inside were emails between my brother and some real estate company about a sealed bid auction scheduled for next month. Our family farm, the land that had been in our family for 4 generations. The place where Dad taught us to ride horses and Mom grew her prize-winning tomatoes before cancer took her when we were teenagers. Dad had been gone only 3 weeks. The emails were dated from 2 days after the funeral. While I was still crying into my coffee every morning, barely able to function through the grief of losing the last parent we had left, my brother was already making deals with strangers to carve up our family's legacy. The correspondence showed he'd been in contact with 3 different real estate firms, shopping around for the best commission rate, like he was selling a used car instead of our ancestral home. I sat in Dad's old leather chair, the same one where he'd read us bedtime stories when we were kids, and felt something break inside my chest. This wasn't just about money or property. This farm was where our grandparents had started their life together after the war, building the original farmhouse with their own hands and nothing but determination. Where our great-grandmother had hidden jewelry in mason jars during the Depression, burying them under the old oak tree that still stood in the front yard like a sentinel guarding our family's secrets. Where 4 generations of our family had lived, worked, sweated, bled, and died. And my brother wanted to sell it to pay off gambling debts. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. While I'd been planning Dad's memorial service and answering sympathy cards from neighbors who remembered when our grandfather first plowed these fields with horses and a single-blade plow, my brother had been calculating how much our family's entire history was worth in today's market. While I'd been sitting by Dad's hospital bed during those final weeks, reading him letters from old friends and holding his hand while he slipped in and out of consciousness, my brother had apparently been researching property values and auction procedures. I remembered those last days so clearly. Dad asking me to promise that the farm would stay in the family, his voice weak but insistent when he talked about the responsibility we'd inherited along with the land. How he'd made me swear that no matter what happened, I wouldn't let developers turn our fields into another shopping center or subdivision. He'd seen it happen to too many neighboring farms, watched as family land got carved up and sold to the highest bidder. And here was my brother, 3 weeks after we'd buried Dad beside Mom under the elm trees at the far edge of the property, trying to do exactly what Dad had feared most. The more I read through the email, the more my horror grew. My brother hadn't just contacted real estate agents, he'd been planning this for months. There were messages dating back to when Dad was still alive, still fighting his battle with cancer. My brother had been researching property values and market conditions while the rest of us focused on Dad's care, making plans to cash in on our father's death before it even happened. I found correspondence with developers interested in turning our farmland into a residential subdivision called Meadowbrook Estates. They'd already drawn up preliminary plans dividing our fields into 43 lots, complete with a community center where our barn currently stood. The same barn where Dad had taught us to milk cows and where our grandfather had stored his tools. There were emails discussing the demolition of our farmhouse, the one our great-grandfather had built board by board in 1923. The developers called it a teardown, noting that the foundation might be salvageable for a more modern structure. They talked about our family's century of memories like it was just an obstacle to profitable development. I confronted him that evening. He was in the barn pretending to fix the tractor, but I could smell the whiskey on his breath from 10 feet away. The same barn where we'd spent countless summer afternoons building hay forts and catching fireflies, where Dad had taught us to milk cows and stack hay bales, where our grandfather had sheltered his horses during winter storms, and where our great-grandfather had first stored his harvest. Now it felt like a crime scene. "You can't sell this place," I said, waving the papers at him. He didn't even look up from the engine. "Dad left it to me. I can do whatever I want with it." His voice was flat, emotionless, like he was discussing the weather instead of destroying our family's entire history. I watched him fumble with a wrench, his hands shaking slightly from either the alcohol or the stress of his situation. The same hands that Dad had taught to change oil and repair equipment, now trembling with the weight of his betrayal. That wasn't entirely true. Dad's will stated that my brother inherited the farm, but only if he maintained it as a working operation for at least 5 years. If he sold it before then, ownership would transfer to me. Dad had been very specific about this clause, having seen too many family farms get sold off and turned into strip malls or housing developments. He'd witnessed the slow death of rural communities as farmland got carved up and sold to the highest bidder, watching as neighbors who'd farmed for generations were forced to sell to developers who saw only dollar signs where others saw heritage. My brother knew this, which is why he was trying to sell it in secret. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked, my voice barely controlled. My brother finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and defensive. Since before Dad died, he admitted without shame. I knew I'd inherit it eventually. The casual way he said it made me physically sick. While Dad was fighting cancer, barely able to walk to the mailbox without getting winded, my brother had been calculating how much money our family's legacy would bring him. While I was driving Dad to chemotherapy appointments and helping him manage his medications, sitting with him during those endless hours in sterile waiting rooms where the smell of disinfectant couldn't mask the fear that permeated everything, my brother was apparently researching real estate markets and auction procedures. While I was helping Dad write letters to old friends, knowing they might be his last communications with people who'd shared decades of memories, my brother was drafting emails to real estate agents. While I was reading Dad his favorite passages from farming journals and listening to him tell stories about growing up on this land, my brother was planning to destroy it all for cash. I spent the next week digging into his finances, using passwords I'd found written in Dad's handwriting in various notebooks around the house. Dad had always been old-fashioned about keeping track of important information, writing everything down in his careful script. He'd kept meticulous records of everything: livestock vaccinations, crop yields, equipment maintenance schedules. He believed in documentation, in leaving a paper trail that future generations could follow. What I found when I accessed my brother's accounts made my stomach turn and my hands shake with rage. Gambling debts totaling $67,000 spread across multiple online platforms. Credit cards maxed out with cash advances that went straight to sports betting sites and online casinos. Bank statements showing transfers to poker rooms and gambling apps that started small, $20 here, $50 there, but escalated dramatically over the past 18 months to hundreds and then thousands at a time. The pattern was clear and devastating. My brother had developed a serious gambling addiction sometime after Dad's cancer diagnosis. Maybe the stress of watching our father deteriorate had triggered something in him, or maybe he'd just gotten in too deep and couldn't stop. Either way, he'd been hemorrhaging money at an alarming rate while the rest of us focused on Dad's care. I traced the progression through his bank statements like following a disease through someone's body. It started innocently enough, small bets on football games, maybe $20 on a Sunday afternoon. Then it was $50 on basketball, $100 on horse racing. Within 6 months, he was betting $500 on single games. Within a year, he was taking cash advances to cover losses and betting even more to try to win it back. The classic spiral of addiction, except he was financing it with our family's future. But the worst discovery came when I found loan documents with Dad's forged signature. My brother had been using the farm as collateral for personal loans that Dad never knew existed. 3 different banks thought they had legitimate claims on our property based on documents that my brother had fraudulently signed in Dad's name during those final months when Dad could barely hold a pen. I compared the signatures to Dad's real handwriting from the same time period. The difference was obvious once you knew what to look for. Dad's genuine signatures had become shaky and uncertain as his illness progressed, but they still maintained his characteristic loops and angles. The forged signatures were too steady, too confident. My brother had been practicing Dad's signature, but he couldn't replicate the weakness that cancer had brought to our father's hands. I sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by evidence of my brother's deception, and felt a rage I'd never experienced before. Not only was he stealing our inheritance, but he'd been stealing from Dad while he was dying, taking advantage of a man who trusted his own son completely, who never would have suspected that his boy was forging his signature on loan agreements that put our entire family legacy at risk. The farm was worth $300,000 according to the most recent appraisal, more than enough to clear his debts and give him a fresh start somewhere else, probably in a city where he could disappear and start over. He was willing to throw away our entire family legacy for poker chips and horse bets, treating generations of hard work and sacrifice like it was worth nothing more than his next gambling fix. I found text messages on his phone that he'd left charging in the kitchen, threats from people with names I didn't recognize, messages that started as professional reminders about overdue payments, but escalated to personal warnings about consequences for continued delays. Photos of our house taken from different angles, like someone was casing the property, screenshots of our address with messages about final deadlines and what would happen if payment wasn't received. The most chilling was a message that simply said, "Your sister looks like she walks alone a lot. Would be a shame if something happened to her." They were threatening me to get to him. When I confronted him with the evidence I'd gathered, printing out every bank statement and loan document and spreading them across Dad's kitchen table like evidence in a criminal trial, he finally admitted everything. We sat in Dad's kitchen, the same room where our family had shared thousands of meals over the decades, where Mom had taught us to make her famous apple pie, and where Dad had helped us with homework at this very table. Now it felt like a courtroom. "I'm drowning," he said, his hands visibly shaking as he looked through the papers. "These people are going to kill me if I don't pay up." He showed me more text messages, scrolling through threats that had become increasingly specific and frightening, references to what happened to other people who didn't pay, descriptions of consequences that made it clear these weren't empty threats, names of family members, including mine, with suggestions about how pressure could be applied. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, he looked genuinely scared instead of just defensive. "How long have they been threatening you?" I asked. 3 months, he admitted. "It started when I missed the first payment. They gave me extensions at first, but then the interest kept building, and I kept thinking I could win it back if I just had one good night." "So you thought you'd just steal our inheritance and run?" His face hardened, the vulnerability disappearing behind a wall of defensive anger. "It's not stealing if it's mine, but it wasn't his. Not legally. Not yet." And that's when I realized how far he'd already gone to cover his tracks and prepare for the sale. The auction papers were dated for the following Tuesday, just 5 days away. He'd already been showing the property to potential buyers, telling them it was an estate sale due to family circumstances that required a quick resolution. He'd printed professional-looking flyers describing the farm's agricultural potential and development opportunities, making it sound like prime real estate instead of our family's sacred ground. The flyers were well-designed and convincing, describing 127 acres of prime farmland with development potential, excellent road access, and municipal water and sewer availability. They mentioned the charming original farmhouse and outbuildings, but only as quaint features that added character to the property. There was no mention of the generations of our family who'd lived and worked here, no acknowledgement of the history that made this place irreplaceable. Even worse, he'd already started moving Dad's antique farm equipment to a storage unit across town, planning to sell those pieces separately for immediate cash. Our grandfather's 1952 Ford tractor, the one Dad had spent years restoring by hand in this very barn, was sitting in some warehouse being appraised by strangers who had no idea of its sentimental value. Mom's collection of vintage milk cans, which she'd spent decades gathering from estate sales and flea markets, had been photographed and cataloged for an online auction. Each can had a story. This one came from a farm in Indiana, where she'd stopped during a road trip. That one was a gift from a neighbor who was moving to town. To my brother, they were just marketable antiques. Dad's tool collection, some pieces dating back to our great-grandfather, had been sorted into lots for sale. Hand tools that had built this farm, that had been passed down from father to son for 4 generations, were now tagged with price stickers like items at a garage sale. My brother had systematically begun erasing our family's history, one piece at a time, treating each item like merchandise instead of irreplaceable memories. Every tool that had been passed down from father to son, every piece of equipment that held stories of harvest seasons and hard winters, every family heirloom was just another asset to be liquidated in service of his gambling addiction. I walked through the house that night, seeing it with new eyes. The kitchen table where we'd done homework while Mom cooked dinner, where Dad had spread out seed catalogs and planned each spring's planting. The living room where we'd opened Christmas presents and watched Dad fall asleep in his recliner during football games, where the whole family would gather to watch the weather reports during storm season. The back porch where he'd taught us to clean fish and tie knots, where he'd sit every evening to watch the sunset over his fields and plan the next day's work. Every corner held memories that my brother was willing to sell to strangers who would never understand what they were buying. But there was one thing my brother didn't know, one crucial detail he'd overlooked in his desperate rush to convert our legacy into cash. 3 days before Dad died, when he was still coherent but barely conscious, he'd called our family lawyer to his hospital bedside. I'd been there, holding Dad's hand while he whispered instructions about a codicil to his will, a final addition that would protect the farm from exactly what my brother was trying to do. Dad had somehow sensed that his death might trigger a crisis in our family. Maybe he'd noticed my brother's increased stress and erratic behavior during those final weeks. Maybe he'd discovered some evidence of the gambling debts. Or maybe he just had the wisdom that comes from seeing several generations live and die on the same piece of land, knowing that desperate people do desperate things when they think no one is watching. I remembered that conversation clearly now. Dad's voice was weak but determined as he explained his concerns to the lawyer. He'd seen what happened to other farming families when the original landowner died, how debts and desperation could tear apart what had taken generations to build. He'd watched neighbors lose family farms to bankruptcy and bad decisions, seen century-old operations get sold off piece by piece. The lawyer had filed the paperwork immediately, creating a legal safeguard that Dad hoped would never be necessary. Any attempt to sell the farm within the first year after Dad's death would automatically trigger an investigation into the inheritor's fitness to manage the estate. If fraud, coercion, or financial misconduct was discovered, ownership would immediately transfer to the secondary beneficiary, me. Dad had protected our family's legacy even from beyond the grave. That night, I called the lawyer and explained everything I'd discovered. The forged loan documents, the gambling debts, the secret auction arrangements, the threats from loan sharks. I sent photos of every piece of evidence, every bank statement, every threatening text message. I documented my brother's gambling addiction with screenshots of his betting history, cash advances, and debt accumulation. The lawyer was shocked, but not entirely surprised. He'd seen similar cases before, he told me. Family members who thought they could circumvent estate restrictions through fraud or deception. But he'd never seen such a comprehensive pattern of financial misconduct combined with identity theft of a dying parent. Within hours, we had filed an emergency injunction stopping the auction and freezing all assets related to the estate. The legal papers were extensive and detailed, citing evidence of fraud, forgery, financial elder abuse, and unfitness to inherit. We requested immediate transfer of ownership and criminal investigation of the forged loan documents. The real estate companies were notified that any sale would be legally invalid and that they could face criminal charges for knowingly participating in fraudulent property transactions. The storage unit was secured by court order, preventing my brother from removing any more of Dad's belongings. Bank accounts were frozen pending investigation. The auction company was served with papers canceling the sale and demanding they preserve all documentation. My brother found out the next morning when he arrived at the farm for the first scheduled property showing, only to find a sheriff's deputy posted at our front gate with legal documents declaring the entire estate under court protection. Potential buyers were turned away, and the auction company representatives were served with papers as they arrived to prepare for the viewing. He called me immediately, screaming into the phone with a rage I'd never heard from him before. "You had no right to interfere," he yelled. "This is my property. You're stealing what Dad left me. I can hear you've been talking to lawyers behind my back. You've been plotting against me this whole time." His voice was raw with fury and panic. I could hear him pacing, probably in the barn where he'd gone to hide from the sheriff's deputy. The same barn where we'd played as children, now the scene of his desperate phone call. "Actually," I said as calmly as I could manage, "as of this morning, it's mine. The judge reviewed your forged loan documents and the evidence of your gambling addiction. You've been declared unfit to manage the estate under the terms of Dad's codicil." The silence on the other end of the phone lasted nearly 2 minutes. I could hear him breathing, could almost feel him processing the reality that his scheme had not only failed, but had cost him everything he was supposed to inherit. In trying to steal what wasn't legally his yet, he'd lost everything that should have been his eventually. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, smaller, defeated. "What am I supposed to do about the money I owe? These people aren't going to just forget about it because I don't have the farm anymore. They know where I live. They know where you live. They've made that very clear." I felt a chill as I remembered the threatening messages I'd seen on his phone, the photos of our house, the references to my daily routines. These weren't just financial obligations. They were dangerous people who'd invested time and effort in tracking our family. That's not my problem anymore, I said, though I knew it would become my problem if these people decided to pursue other forms of collection. You made your choices. You gambled away your inheritance before you even had it. But you have until noon tomorrow to remove your personal belongings from the house. The locks are being changed at 1 o'clock, and after that, you'll be trespassing. I hung up and immediately called the sheriff's department to report the threats I'd discovered. They took the matter seriously, especially when I showed them the photos and messages that indicated surveillance of our property. They agreed to increase patrols in our area and advised me to install security cameras and change all the locks immediately. I sat in Dad's kitchen that night, looking out at the fields where our corn would be planted next spring, the same fields where my great-grandfather had worked with a horse and plow, clearing stones by hand and building the foundation for everything that came after, where my grandfather had introduced the first tractor, modernizing operations while maintaining the family traditions, where Dad had taught us to drive when we were barely tall enough to reach the pedals, passing down not just skills, but values about hard work and taking care of what's been entrusted to you. My brother packed his truck in silence the next day, loading boxes of clothes and personal items while I watched from the front porch where Dad used to sit every evening, surveying his domain and planning the next day's work. Neighbors drove by slowly, curious about the sheriff's car that had been parked in our driveway and the obvious tension hanging over our property. Word travels fast in rural communities, and by now, everyone knew something was wrong at our place. When my brother finished loading, he walked over to where I was sitting in Dad's old rocking chair, the one our grandfather had made by hand during the winter of 1967. "You think you've won something here?" he said, his voice bitter with resentment. "But you have no idea how to run this place. You'll be bankrupt within 2 years, and then what? At least I would have gotten something out of it before it all fell apart. At least I would have paid off my debts and had a chance to start over." "Maybe," I said, looking out at the land that was now officially mine to protect. "But at least I'll fail trying to honor what Dad built instead of selling it off for gambling money." His face twisted with anger and something that might have been shame. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under. You don't know what it's like to have people threatening your family. I was trying to protect us. By stealing from us?" He had no answer for that. He climbed into his truck and drove away that afternoon, and I never saw him again. The loan sharks kept calling for several weeks, but when they realized my brother was gone and they had no legal claim on the farm, the threats gradually stopped. The forged loans were voided due to fraud, and the banks had to write off the debts as losses from their own inadequate verification procedures. The auction company demanded compensation for their time and advertising costs, but the judge ruled that they should have verified ownership before proceeding. Some of my brother's creditors tried to pursue me directly, claiming I was responsible for his debts as his family member. I had to hire an attorney to make it clear that I had no legal obligation for debts incurred through fraud. It took months to untangle all the financial mess my brother had created, but eventually the legitimate debts were discharged and the fraudulent ones were voided. I found myself alone on the farm for the first time in my life, surrounded by 4 generations of family history and the enormous responsibility of keeping it all intact. The weight of it was overwhelming at first. Every morning I'd wake up and walk through the house, seeing Dad's coffee cup still in the dish drainer, his reading glasses on the kitchen table, his work boots by the back door where he'd left them the last time he'd been strong enough to check on the cattle. The silence was deafening. This house had never been quiet. There'd always been the sounds of family life, of work being done, of animals needing attention. Now it felt like a museum, preserved but empty of the life that had made it meaningful. But gradually, I began to see possibility instead of just obligation. I spent hours reading through Dad's journals, learning about crop rotations and soil management, about which fields produced the best yields and which needed more attention. I studied his careful notes about weather patterns and market prices, about when to plant and when to harvest. He documented everything with the thoroughness of a man who knew his knowledge would need to be passed on. His record-keeping was meticulous and comprehensive. He'd tracked rainfall amounts, soil temperatures, pest problems, and equipment maintenance schedules. He'd noted which varieties of corn performed best in wet years versus dry years, which fields needed additional drainage, and which corners of the property were prone to erosion. More importantly, he'd written about the philosophy of farming, about being a steward of the land rather than just an exploiter of it, about the responsibility that comes with owning something that will outlast you, about the importance of thinking in generations rather than quarters. 6 months later, I hired a property manager who specialized in small family farms, someone who understood that profitability didn't have to come at the expense of tradition. We converted part of the land to organic vegetables and started a community-supported agriculture program. The same fields that my brother wanted to sell to developers now feed 40 families in our county, providing fresh produce while generating steady income. The CSA program was more work than traditional farming, but it connected us directly to the people who ate our food. Members would visit the farm to pick up their weekly shares, and many brought their children to see where vegetables actually come from. Kids who thought food came from grocery stores learned about planting and harvesting, about the work and weather that goes into every meal. I started a small farmers market stand that became popular with city people looking for authentic rural experiences. Families would drive out from town to pick their own vegetables, learn about farming, and connect with the land in ways that their grandparents had taken for granted. Children who had never seen a cow up close would spend hours in our pastures, asking endless questions about farm life. The farm became not just sustainable, but profitable, generating income while maintaining its character. We hosted school groups and scout troops, teaching kids about agriculture and environmental stewardship. The old barn became a venue for weddings and community events, bringing people together in the same space where 4 generations of our family had worked. I restored Mom's garden, planting heirloom varieties of the tomatoes she'd grown, the ones that had won ribbons at the county fair year after year. I found her gardening journal and followed her notes about companion planting and organic pest control. The first time I harvested tomatoes from plants grown from her saved seeds, I cried right there in the garden. Dad's tool collection came back from the storage unit in perfect condition. I spent weeks organizing everything in the barn, hanging each tool in its proper place according to the outlines Dad had drawn on the pegboard. Having everything back where it belonged felt like bringing Dad home. I found Dad's final journal entry, written just weeks before he died, tucked between the pages of his favorite farming almanac. Some things are worth more than money, he'd written in his careful handwriting. Some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting costs everything you thought you wanted. Reading those words, I understood that Dad had known exactly what might happen after his death. The codicil wasn't just legal protection. It was his way of ensuring that the right person would inherit not just the property, but the responsibility to preserve what generations of our family had built. The neighboring farms began to take notice of what we were doing. Other family operations that had been struggling with profitability started asking questions about our CSA program and agritourism initiatives. Some implemented similar programs, creating a network of small farms that supported each other while serving the community. We started hosting annual harvest festivals that drew hundreds of people from across the region. Families would come to pick pumpkins, ride hay wagons, and learn about traditional farming methods. Local artisans sold crafts, and we featured live music from regional performers. The festival became a celebration not just of our farm, but of rural culture and community. Local schools started bringing students for educational tours. We developed curriculum about sustainable agriculture, environmental science, and rural history. Kids would plant seeds in spring and return in fall to harvest what they'd grown. Many of these students had never been on a working farm, and some discovered interests that would shape their career choices. The farm's success attracted attention from agricultural extension services and university researchers. We became a demonstration site for sustainable farming practices, hosting workshops for other farmers, and serving as a living laboratory for new techniques. Graduate students conducted research projects on our land, studying everything from soil health to pollinator habitats. Last month, I received a letter from a law firm representing my brother. He was contesting the estate ruling, claiming I'd manipulated Dad while he was dying and demanding his inheritance back, plus damages for mental anguish and lost opportunities. The letter was full of legal threats and accusations, painting me as a scheming relative who had taken advantage of an elderly man's confusion. The lawsuit alleged that I'd influenced Dad to change his will while he was mentally incapacitated, that the codicil was invalid because Dad didn't understand what he was signing, and that I'd conspired with a lawyer to defraud my brother of his rightful inheritance. It demanded immediate transfer of the property plus 3 years of profits as compensation for lost opportunity. I threw the letter in the trash and walked out to the fields where our winter wheat was just starting to show green shoots through the snow. The same fields where 4 generations of our family had worked. Where my future children would someday learn to drive tractors and plant seeds and understand what it means to be connected to something larger than yourself. My brother could hire all the lawyers he wanted. Some battles are worth fighting, no matter what they cost. And some things, once saved, become more precious than anything money could ever buy. My attorney was confident that the lawsuit had no merit. We had extensive documentation of my brother's fraud and gambling addiction, along with testimony from the original lawyer about Dad's mental state when he signed the codicil. The judge who'd initially ruled on the estate case had been thorough and careful, and his decision was well supported by evidence. More importantly, I now had 3 years of successful farm operation to demonstrate that Dad's decision had been the right one. The farm was thriving, profitable, and serving the community in ways it never had before. I'd proven that I could be a responsible steward of the land, exactly what Dad had hoped for when he wrote that codicil. The farm is still here, still in our family, still growing things that matter. Last week, I got a call from the county extension office. They want to feature our farm in a documentary about sustainable agriculture and family farming traditions. The same land my brother tried to auction off to pay gambling debts will now be showcased as a model for preserving rural heritage while adapting to modern challenges. The documentary crew spent 3 days filming, interviewing me about our transition from traditional farming to sustainable agriculture, our community programs, and the importance of keeping family farms operational. They captured footage of children picking vegetables, families attending workshops, and the daily work that keeps the farm running. When they asked about my brother's attempt to sell the farm, I was honest about what had happened while protecting his privacy. I talked about the challenges facing family farms when the original owners die, about the pressure to sell to developers, and about the importance of having legal protections in place to preserve agricultural land. That evening, I sat in Dad's rocking chair on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the fields gold and red. I thought about my brother, wherever he was, and wondered if he ever thought about what he'd tried to destroy. I thought about Dad, and whether he'd be proud of what I'd managed to preserve and build upon his foundation. A neighbor stopped by with fresh eggs and stayed to chat about the upcoming planting season. Another farmer called to discuss sharing equipment for the harvest. These are the connections that my brother never understood, the network of relationships that make rural life possible. You can't auction off community. You can't sell belonging. The threats from loan sharks had stopped completely after the first year. My brother had apparently found other ways to deal with his debts, though I never learned the details. Sometimes I worried about his safety, despite everything he'd done. He was still my brother, still the boy who'd built hay forts with me and learned to drive tractors by my side. But I'd learned to live with the uncertainty. Some relationships can't be repaired, Some trust can't be rebuilt. The farm had taught me about the cycles of growth and loss, about the importance of protecting what matters even when protection requires difficult choices. The local newspaper ran a feature story about our farm's transformation, highlighting our role in the community and our success in sustainable agriculture. The article mentioned that the farm had been in our family for 4 generations and was now serving as a model for other family operations facing similar challenges. Orders for our produce increased dramatically after the article appeared. We had to expand our growing area and hire additional help during harvest season. The farmer's market stand became so popular that we opened a second location in the neighboring county. The farm is quiet now, except for the wind through the corn and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night. It's the same peaceful sound that has marked the end of day here for over a century. The same sound my great-grandmother heard when she finished hiding jewelry in mason jars. The same sound my grandfather heard after days spent clearing fields with horses. The same sound Dad heard every night of his life. Some things are worth more than money. Some things are worth fighting for, even when fighting costs everything. The farm endures. The family endures. The community we've built here grows stronger every year. And sometimes that's enough victory for a lifetime. Last month, a young couple approached me about learning sustainable farming techniques. They'd graduated from agricultural college but wanted hands-on experience before starting their own operation. I hired them as apprentices, teaching them what Dad had taught me, what his father had taught him, watching them learn to read the soil and understand the weather patterns, seeing their excitement when they successfully grafted their first fruit trees. I realized that Dad's legacy wasn't just about preserving the past. It was about nurturing the future. The farm that my brother tried to destroy for gambling money now feeds dozens of families, educates hundreds of children, and trains the next generation of sustainable farmers. It serves as proof that some things, once saved, become more valuable than anyone could have imagined. That's the difference between seeing land as an asset and understanding it as a responsibility. My brother saw 127 acres worth $300,000. I see 4 generations of family history and countless futures still to be written. The difference saved everything that mattered.